The greatest freedom you can know is to realize that you're nothing, not a thing. What you really are is a process. I shall go through some quotes in a bit just to add a bit of meat to all of this. The belief that you are a thing is a kind of trick of evolution. Because if you believe you're a thing, a person, then you're going to work so much harder to preserve your existence. Because you don't want to lose, if you have this feeling that you're a person, then you're not going to want to lose that. So it's a kind of a trick. Because obviously you do lose it upon death. But anyway, during life we think we're a person, that we do stuff, have stuff, know stuff, know people, a whole kind of array of things that makes us believe that we are someone. Now, the net result of that is that you then are even more shit scared of dying, because you don't want to lose that someone. If you look at animals, I don't think they really have a sense of I'm someone. And in fact the language we use doesn't help matters, it's very subject oriented. I, we, me, mine, yours, all those kind of words. And so we believe we've got a self, but animals don't seem to have that. Sure enough, if some huge great lion appears on the scene, then gazelles look scared. And they want to preserve their being, their existence, so they run for hell. Or run like hell. But that's an instinctive thing. I don't think there's any kind of, I'm such a nice person, this shouldn't happen to me, all that kind of shit. So anyway, this belief that we are a person is nature's great trick. And it's the reason we're so successful as a species. Because we not only consider what's happening today, we consider what might be happening in 6 months' time. And we kind of plan and scheme to make sure there's food on the table in 6 months or a year. So we're very good at surviving. But the main driver behind all of that is the belief that we are a person, and we want to preserve that person that we believe we are. We kind of fall in love with it. Fall in love with our own emotional states, our own thoughts, our own desires, our own body. It's foolish really, because we're falling in love with all the things that are temporary, temporal. They're going to disappear at some point in the future. This belief that we are someone creates an awful lot of pain, a lot of anxiety. And in fact, anxiety is the driving engine of what you might call the ego or the sense of self. Because we become anxious if there's any threat to the existence of this thing we think is a self. So to become free of all of that, obviously, is going to free us of all that anxiety. So let's go through a couple of quotes. I'll make some comments as we go through them. There's a great quote here from Plato. You may, if you have some passing acquaintance with philosophy, then you'll know that of Plato's cave analogy. We're like creatures looking at a wall, and all we can see are shadows of things that are moving around behind us. And all we can see is our own shadow, because there's a light shining into the cave. So we see the shadows and we see our own shadow. But we don't see reality. This is very similar to Kant's idea that we only see our own representations of things. In fact, this self that we have created is just a representation. It's not something that's real. Anyway, Plato said, the things of this world perceived by our senses have no true being at all. They're always becoming, but they never are. So here's this thing of being a process instead of being a thing. You are a process. You go from birth, to being this chubby little baby, through to old age, to being some wrinkled old prune that dies of something horrible. And there's a process involved, and all the way along that process, from one day to the next, you are not the same entity. So your body today is different from your body yesterday, and they say, is it 7 years? The body is pretty well completely renewed. The matter in the body has completely changed. So it's not the same body from one day to another. Whatever you ate yesterday is sitting in your colon or something. It's not the same as it was yesterday. And your mind isn't the same. Yesterday you hadn't come across this podcast, so your mind has changed. So you can't really say me, I, self, because you're aiming at a moving target. There is no such thing. It's just a process that's unfolding. We're always becoming, but never are. I've got a more devastating thing from Spinoza actually on the next slide. But the reality is that you are not a thing. You are no thing. You are zero. You're just part of an unwinding that takes place in this phenomenal world. And just as a little, a very short digression, because this gets fairly heavy fairly quickly, but this phenomenal world we know is dominated by two great separators, time and space. Time separates us, obviously, in the dimension of time. What happened 100 years ago is quite different to what's happening now, and in fact the people around 100 years ago were quite different. So it's a great separator. But the other great separator is space. Things can exist side by side. But space and time are actually just modes of our consciousness. There is no real space and time other than as a basic mechanism of our mind to represent the world. What the world is, we don't really know. So this becoming happens in space and time. The whole thing is a fucking movie show. We are almost like watching a movie on a screen. The screen is space and time. And the continuity from one bit of the movie to the other is caused by, or is controlled by, cause and effect. Somebody jumps off a cliff, 5 or 10 seconds later, they're dead. Cause and effect. Jump off the cliff, die. And that's our world. Always becoming. Always the constant operation of cause and effect. Anyway, that's enough of a digression on that. So, let me quote Spinoza. And this is a knife through the heart. In the way that only Spinoza could do it. I've said many times before that Spinoza's the real hard man of philosophy. If you want to get down to basics, you have to read Spinoza. He doesn't pull any punches. There's no bullshit. So, he says, the essence of man does not involve necessary existence. We don't exist. Existence is not a property of our essence. Very briefly on what an essence is. An essence is the thing that defines a thing, for Spinoza. Or the thing that causes it. Depends on context exactly, but basically the foundation for a thing. The essence of man does not involve necessary existence. Now, just very briefly on Spinoza, what does exist for Spinoza? Well, existence exists. But existence is not part of what we are. So, we're like mirages. We appear when conditions change and we disappear. Existence is not a property of what we are. If existence was a property of what we are, then we'd exist forever. But existence is not a property of what we are. So really, we're like mirages, what Spinoza calls modes, but I'm not going to go into all that. Finally, let's talk about Schopenhauer. This is one of my favorite quotes from anybody, from any book, from any philosopher, because this is the key to freedom. It's not the context in which Schopenhauer quotes this. This is from The World as Will and Representation, Denial of the Will to Life. He says, however, he will be least afraid of becoming nothing in death who has recognized that he is already nothing now. To realize that you're nothing now is a big thing. And he goes on to explain that to become nothing means that you have understood the nature of the game, you understand how you fit into the game, and realize actually that you're nothing. Not a thing. Because what's the benefit of realizing that you're nothing? Well, nothing. All of a sudden, nothing is important. You are not important. To lose this sense of self-importance is a tremendous liberation. You know, instead of sitting there thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh my God, I've got to get enlightenment. I need to be saved. I need to do this. I need to do that. All of which is driven by ego. You know, the idea of enlightenment is that we arrive at some happier place, just ego wanting something nicer. The ego pushes all this along, but to realize that you are nothing, which is not a trivial thing, to realize you are nothing is the ultimate freedom, because you have to get slightly kind of I don't know, I hate the word spiritual, but to get slightly spiritual or more philosophical, talk about being. Being itself does not exist. It is existence, but it's not a thing. So all of a sudden, oh, I'm nothing. Nothing I do actually is the least bit important. All these thoughts, all these emotions, all this bodily condition I've got, all these desires, well, yeah, fuck it. It's just a process taking place. Let's go and eat the donuts. Let's go down to the beach for a day. Or as Albert Camus did, you know, the philosopher at the beginning of the last century. He did all his philosophizing, then realized that everything is absurd. And to realize you're nothing is to realize a similar thing. It's all kind of absurd, although absurd has a kind of emotional ring to it. It's nothing. So what did he do? He thought, oh, fuck this, I'm going to go and play football. Which he did. You're nothing. So just go with the flow. Go down to the beach. Go and eat donuts. You know, go and have rabid sex for 3 days, or you know, whatever it is that your inner beast wants to do. But let me say one thing to qualify that. Your inner beast has no interest in all of this. None. It might like the idea of the kind of freedom that might come from realizing that you're nothing. But 10 minutes later it'll be saying, oh my God, you've got to earn more money, or we can't pay the rent, or something. So that you're in a survival drive will drop in again and cause you to do whatever you need to do. This realization that you're nothing comes from understanding. The only thing that's going to give you inner freedom is understanding. Seeing behind the veil of Maya, as the Indians would say. It's the only thing that's going to do it. Meditating for 2 hours every day probably isn't going to do it. Going to your $2,000 retreats almost certainly isn't going to do it. Self-help isn't going to do it. Understanding is the only thing that's going to do it. And that means hard work. And as Spinoza says, if this was easy, everybody would be doing it. But it's not easy, so very few people do it. Everybody would like to get this kind of inner sense of freedom and liberation that comes from understanding you're nothing. You're just a process, part of some large unfolding of which you have no control. So, go and eat the donuts or whatever. But to realize that you are nothing comes from a lot of hard work in terms of trying to understand how this whole show works. Anyway, on that I'll finish. It ties in very nicely with the 5 fools, and this is basically the zero fool, who knows that he or she is nothing. Delightful.